There are moments on the highway when everything feels routine. Same speed, same lanes, same assumptions that the rules are exactly what you remember from your last drive. But the truth is, highway traffic law is one of the most quietly evolving areas of legal enforcement in the United States. And what most drivers don't realize is that small legal updates in highway regulations can change how enforcement happens long before the average person even hears about them. Now here's the question. Do you think most drivers are actually aware of lesser-known highway traffic laws, or do they only learn about them after they receive a warning or citation? Share your answer in the comments. Now let's slow this down and approach it properly. When people hear secret highway traffic law, it often sounds dramatic. But in reality, what we are really talking about is under-discussed or poorly understood regulations that already exist within state transportation codes and federal highway safety frameworks. In my legal analysis, there is no single hidden law that applies universally across all states. Instead, what exists is a layered system of regulations, state traffic codes, federal highway safety guidelines, and enforcement policies that vary depending on jurisdiction. The federal government, through agencies involved in transportation safety, provides broad standards and funding requirements, but individual states control the actual traffic laws that drivers experience on the road. This creates a system where two drivers traveling on different highways in different states may be subject to similar principles but different enforcement rules. Now, to understand this properly, we need to connect it to constitutional structure. Driving on public highways is regulated under state police powers, meaning states are allowed to create and enforce rules designed to protect public safety, manage traffic flow, and reduce accidents. However, even within that authority, courts would likely evaluate whether enforcement practices comply with constitutional protections, particularly under the 14th Amendment's due process and equal protection principles. That means laws must not only exist, they must be applied fairly, consistently, and with reasonable notice. Now let's talk about what makes highway traffic law feel hidden to many drivers. In my legal analysis, it is not that the laws are secret. It is that enforcement priorities change over time. For example, certain violations may not always be heavily enforced until new safety data, accident trends, or policy updates shift enforcement focus. That means a behavior that was previously overlooked may suddenly become a priority for enforcement, without the driver realizing the shift occurred. Courts would likely examine whether such shifts in enforcement still respect fair notice principles and whether penalties are applied in a consistent manner across similar cases. Now let's bring in real-world impact. For everyday drivers, the most significant risk is not intentional violation. It is outdated assumptions. Many people rely on driving habits formed years earlier without realizing that enforcement standards may have changed. In my legal analysis, this is where most highway citations actually originate. Not from dangerous intent, but from small compliance gaps between what drivers believe is allowed and what current regulations require. Now, from a constitutional perspective, the Fourth Amendment becomes relevant in highway enforcement through stops, inspections, and vehicle-related investigations. Courts would likely evaluate whether stops are based on reasonable suspicion and whether any further action taken by law enforcement is proportionate to the observed behavior. The Fifth Amendment may also become relevant in situations where statements made during traffic interactions could potentially be used in legal proceedings, though always within the framework of lawful and respectful interaction. Now let's consider federal versus state structure again, because this is essential. Highway traffic laws are primarily state-driven, but federal influence exists through funding requirements and national safety standards. That means, while rules may vary by state, there is still a broader national framework influencing how those rules are shaped. Courts would likely examine whether state-level variations still meet constitutional standards, particularly when similar behavior results in significantly different outcomes depending on location. There is a strong legal argument that highway traffic laws should maintain a level of consistency to ensure fairness and predictability for drivers traveling across state lines. At the same time, another perspective raised in policy discussions is that states need flexibility to adjust traffic enforcement based on local conditions, such as congestion levels, road design, and accident statistics. In my legal analysis, both perspectives are valid and continue to shape how traffic law evolves. Now let's talk about what makes highway enforcement feel unpredictable to some drivers. It is not necessarily the existence of laws. It is the timing of enforcement emphasis. Certain rules may exist for years, but enforcement focus can increase when data shows rising risk in specific behaviors. Courts would likely evaluate whether enforcement remains consistent and whether drivers had reasonable opportunity to understand the expectations before penalties are applied. Now, before we continue into the specific types of lesser-known highway regulations and how they are applied in real enforcement scenarios, it is important to emphasize one key principle. The purpose of highway traffic law is not to surprise drivers. It is to maintain safety, order, and predictability on roads that are used by millions of people every day. So as we move into the next part, we will break down how these lesser-known rules actually appear in real enforcement situations, what triggers citations most commonly, and what drivers should understand to avoid unnecessary legal risk while staying fully compliant. Stay with me, because this is where abstract legal rules become real-world consequences that can affect any driver at any time on the highway. When we move from written highway regulations into real-world enforcement, the most important shift is understanding that the law does not operate in isolation. It operates through interpretation, discretion, and context. In my legal analysis, this is where most surprise traffic situations actually come from. Not from new laws being created overnight, but from how existing laws are enforced more strictly in response to updated safety data or policy priorities. Courts would likely examine whether enforcement actions on highways are based on objective legal standards such as speed thresholds, lane discipline rules, or following distance requirements, rather than arbitrary or inconsistent application. Now, one of the most commonly misunderstood aspects of highway traffic law is that many rules already exist in state codes, but are not always heavily enforced until conditions change. For example, certain lane usage rules, merging protocols, or speed variance tolerances may remain technically enforceable at all times, even if drivers have grown used to informal leniency. When enforcement emphasis shifts, drivers may perceive it as a new law, even though legally it is not new at all. In my legal analysis, this gap between legal existence and enforcement awareness is one of the biggest sources of confusion on highways. Now let's connect this to constitutional principles. The Fourth Amendment remains central in highway enforcement because traffic stops must always be grounded in reasonable suspicion or probable cause. Courts would likely evaluate whether stops are justified by observable behavior, such as speeding, unsafe lane changes, or equipment violations, rather than vague or unsupported assumptions. The Fifth Amendment may also become relevant during interactions, but its role is always interpreted within lawful procedure and respectful communication standards. It does not remove legal obligations, but it does ensure that constitutional protections remain intact during enforcement processes. Now, from a broader federal and state perspective, highway traffic laws remain primarily under state control, but federal influence exists through national safety frameworks and transportation funding requirements. This creates a system where states can customize enforcement priorities while still aligning with broader safety expectations. Courts would likely examine whether variations between states create unfair inconsistencies or whether they fall within acceptable ranges of state authority under the Constitution. There is a strong legal argument that drivers should be able to reasonably predict traffic law outcomes, regardless of where they travel, especially on federally supported highway systems. At the same time, another perspective raised in policy discussions is that states must retain flexibility to address unique traffic conditions, infrastructure design, and regional safety challenges. In my legal analysis, both perspectives continue to shape how highway law evolves over time. Now let's talk about real-world consequences. For most drivers, the greatest risk is not intentional violation, it is assumption. People often rely on long-standing habits without realizing that enforcement standards may have shifted due to updated safety priorities. That means behaviors that feel routine, such as speed variation, lane merging practices, or following distance, may suddenly become enforcement priorities when accident data indicates increased risk. Courts would likely consider whether enforcement remains consistent and whether individuals had reasonable opportunity to adapt to updated expectations before penalties are applied. Now, stepping back, it is important to understand that highway law is not designed to operate as a trap system. Its purpose is to create predictable, safe conditions for large volumes of traffic moving at high speed under varying conditions. Supporters of stricter enforcement argue that consistent application of highway rules reduces accidents and improves overall road safety. They emphasize that even small violations can have significant consequences at highway speeds. On the other hand, critics argue that enforcement must be balanced with clear public communication so that drivers are not penalized for rules they were not reasonably aware had changed in emphasis or interpretation. In my legal analysis, both perspectives highlight the same core issue. Clarity and communication are just as important as enforcement itself. Now looking at long-term implications, highway traffic law will likely continue to evolve alongside technology, including automated monitoring systems, digital enforcement tools, and data-driven safety models. This means enforcement may become more consistent in some areas, but also more precise and less forgiving of outdated assumptions. Courts will continue to play a critical role in ensuring that these systems remain fair, transparent, and constitutionally compliant under due process standards. As we reach the conclusion of this breakdown, one final principle becomes clear. Highway traffic law is not just about rules written in code books. It is about how those rules are interpreted, enforced, and understood in real time by millions of drivers sharing the same road system. So here is the final question to consider. Do you believe highway traffic laws today are communicated clearly enough for everyday drivers? Or do you think enforcement is changing faster than public awareness can keep up? Share your thoughts in the comments. Civil discussion is how real understanding develops around issues that affect everyone on the road. And if you want more clear, fact-based explanations of real-world laws and driving updates that actually matter in everyday life, make sure to subscribe for future breakdowns. Because at the end of the day, highway law is not just something written in legislation. It is something you experience every time you merge, accelerate, and make decisions in real time on roads where clarity can make all the difference.